wrong, and elements of what he said and the manner in which he said them that did make things far harder than they should have been. I mean, he said, for instance, in part of that same speech, there will come a day, he said, where the black man holds the whip over the white man. Now, I think that's a terrible thing to say, and I don't think it's come remotely true. And that undoubtedly damaged the whole argument being made on his side. It's the same way, by the way, let me give you another quick example recently. I mean, there's been a debate in Britain that I've been part of on the debate about gay marriage in Britain. And I was saying to somebody I was debating against on this recently, you know, I said, what I'd be really keen on is whatever opposition you, and this particular person was opposed to gay marriage, so whatever you do in it, I hope you can kind of restrain those people on your side who will make your side look ridiculous when they start saying things like, well, in that case you can marry your dog, and things like that. Because you will let down your own argument when, and even things I disagree with, I want the argument to be made at its strongest and its best. And I think that Enoch Powell, to an extent, did make the argument at its worst at that point, but he said something that was true in many important respects. And I think that it's taken a very long time. The poison, the debate which opened up after the Rivers of Blood speech is still felt in British politics. There are, about once every couple of years, there is a political career, usually at a nascent stage in a councillor's position or something, ended because they say somewhere, Enoch Powell was right. So it's still the litmus test. But as I say, I mean, in Enoch Powell's case, in many ways he was right, and in many ways he was wrong. And that makes it a very difficult discussion to base the whole discussion on. And for 4 decades now, we've had it based on Enoch Powell, and that's not where I'd ideally have it.
Lars Knudsen, how do you see your position with the media in your own country? Can you live with this situation, or is it frustrating?
My own position?
Yes.
Oh, I can live with it, obviously. I mean, I do, and make some money from them. So I can't complain entirely. I get given a voice, and I would, by the way, highlight this, that I mean, there are all sorts of problems in the British media, as in other countries' media. We have a total double standard of the kind I was describing earlier. Whereby, for instance, if you've said, say if you're a Conservative councillor who said that Enoch Powell said something that was quite true or something like that, yeah, then the press will make sure that all of that comes back. Whereas if, as somebody who's now a shadow minister, called Diane Abbott, if you said, as she did a few years ago, that your political hero is Mao, then it's all right. You're sort of allowed to get away with it. I did challenge her, I remember, on that. And said, well, what element of it, of the massacre of 60 to 70 million Chinese people, was it that you admired most? But she said that in the end you had to weigh these things up, and that he had led to significant leaps forward in techniques in Chinese agriculture. So there is obviously a very significant double standard in that regard, as in many others. But the crucial one I would cite is that the BBC, for instance, which is the root of a lot of problems in Britain, a lot of problems undoubtedly, and is undoubtedly one-sided. And let me give you one very quick example. They ran a documentary last year on Geert Wilders called "The Most Dangerous Man in Europe?" ? And when I complained repeatedly and vociferously to the chairman of the BBC, the person who wrote back, was one of the commissioners, said in defence that a proof of Geert Wilders' extremism was the fact that he has to be protected by guards. It's what, you know, Churchill said somewhere once. He said, whatever happens, I will never be incapable of discerning the difference between the firefighter and the fire. But much of our media does make that difference. Much of our media mistakes the man standing outside a building with a hose for an arsonist. And that is a problem. I just add one thing, which is that the BBC has in its charter an obligation to put differing sides of an argument. And so I, for instance, do get a good hearing there, pretty good hearing. I tend to be lined up against 4 people who oppose me, but that's all right. The point is, it's bad, but it's not insufferable.
Thank you. Ulle? Katrine first. Oh, sorry.
Ladies first.
Thank you for your presentation. I have some question. I know that you have had a discussion with Kenan Malik, who is a critic of multiculturalism, just as you are. And he's actually coming. He's been to Copenhagen once, and he's coming in 2 weeks' time.
To speak to the
To speak, not here, no. But I'm just curious to know where you disagree with him on multiculturalism.
Malik's an interesting one. This is Kenan Malik. He wrote a book called From Fatwa to Jihad that I reviewed quite well when it came out. But as always happens, whenever you write even one critical line in a review of someone's book, the only person who ever remembers it is the author, who will bear an unstinting grudge until the end of time. They will never forget it. They will forget anything nice you said and spend the rest of their career trying to destroy you. Anyhow, such is the literary scene in Britain, as I know, I'm sure it is here. But Malik, I said at the time his book came out, is interesting because he is one of those people I would describe who is received with the delight that our societies receive the converted sinner. You know, like the prodigal son. We're so delighted when somebody who has been on the wrong side comes to the right side. Quite often it means you neglect all the people who are on the right side all the time. Or take them for granted. But Malik, to a great extent, has been welcomed as somebody who has seen the light on this. But he is a type of a particularly interesting phenomenon who, whilst ending up being right, doesn't want to be seen to be on the right. So he's the sort of person who would open any discussion, as I've heard him do a number of times, by saying, of course I don't agree with X, Y, Z. So, and he does this in his book. And in fact, he gets it wrong as well. He claimed, for instance, that Mark Stein claimed that Muslims were breeding like mosquitoes, which, as I pointed out, he only needed to read Mark Stein's book to realize was wrong. And then I included the page reference for his interest. Because, of course, it was also laboriously proved, as it should never have had to have been in court in Canada, that the phrase in question was said by Mullah Krekar. And among other things, you can tell because Mark Stein writes beforehand, as Mullah Krekar says, and includes quotation marks, which has generally been regarded as being a sign that it is not you that's written it. Anyhow, punctuational niceties, I'm sure. The point is that he said that sort of thing. He attacked Martin Amis. He does various other things. There's a particular type of person, Malik is typical of, who, as I say, will always do that. They will say, well, of course, you know, I'm not like X. I mean, I may think there's a problem with Islamic fundamentalism, but I don't agree with Martin Amis, you know, as if. So, I have a very difficult view with people like this because I think on the one hand one should be grateful that they get the case, but not very grateful that they spend their time having got it attacking everyone else who already has. Or as somebody said to me, a left-wing journalist I know in Britain, I said a while ago, I said, you agree with everything I say and I write, and I know whenever we talk about this, you agree with me, but why do you end up, you know, always having to position yourself in such a way that you say, but of course I don't agree with, you know, Douglas Murray or whatever. And he said, you've got to realize it's political positioning. And I said, yeah, I know, it's political positioning against me, so apologies if I'm not hugely grateful. Anyhow, there is such a class of person, I'm sure there are some here, and by the way, all the people who do that, there'll be many, many more in the years ahead. Many of the people in your politics here who are currently saying all sorts of outrageous things about people who've been saying things that have been true for many years. In about 10, 15 years, you know, you won't be able to move in this country for people who were claiming that they were always on the front line in the cartoon war. They will say, I remember in 2005, it was only me standing between, you know, the jihadis and Gillan Poston. I mean, they will do that. They will catch on later, and they will rewrite their own histories, and they'll pretend they were right all along. And anyone who actually was right, I don't know, will be forgotten about. They'll trample over.
That reminds me about the very many freedom fighters that came out of the woodwork on the 5th of May, 1945. Many more than connected with physical struggle against Nazis and
Most of France, if I remember.
yes, it's one of the 3 million performances, etc. But do we have any serious questions left? Yes. And you do? Yes.
Ole Gerstrom, you speak about politicians. Like here in this country, we have a worthy gentleman, Her Majesty's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Willy Søvndal. He stated yesterday regarding the burning out of the Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris. He said this act was meaningless, a meaningless act. Here he can see the wrath and the power of Allah, who destroys this goddamn magazine, you know, just on the spot, you know, for criticizing Allah and his follower. And so here we have Mr. Søvndal, you know, he sees no meaning in this. Shouldn't we send him to a Quran school, or what would you suggest?
The most consistent idiocy of certainly the last 10 years has been that it has become mainstream to acquiesce in the following line, which comes from much of the Islamic world, which, to summarize, is say my religion is peaceful or I kill you. And a lot of people in public life are simply willing to give themselves as easy a time as possible and go, okay, if that's the deal, I'd rather not get killed. I'll go along with saying it's peaceful, and so on. And I was doing a discussion recently, a debate in New York against a couple of very, in this particular case, very decent, relatively progressive Muslims, and with my friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali on my side. And it was very interesting because at one point the argument was Islam is the religion of peace, and Ayaan and I were on the other side. May have guessed. And it was very interesting because at one point, you know, they were trying to make their case, and it was just amazing because Ayaan said, you know, the people who are trying to kill me are inspired by the book you keep citing, are inspired by this religion. And in a moment of fatal narcissism, one of our opponents said, utterly truthfully, said, you're not the only person on this panel, Ayaan, that is under death threat. I've got an Al-Qaeda fatwa on my head. And you know, I said, well, hang on. If Islam's such a peaceful religion, how come everyone on the panel, from all sides, even the ones saying it is, are under threat of being killed? It can't be. I mean, if we were discussing Quakers, it would probably be easier. The fact is that you learn very swiftly in this game. A little intimidation goes a really long way. And just as we have never had a novel like the Satanic Verses again, whenever anyone does start to try, it's now subdued even further. And Charlie Hebdo is such a crucial case for this reason, because what our societies are doing is bit by bit believing that they can move toward Islam's view of itself. See, I've always taken the view that there is really no danger to our societies from repeated suicide bombings. You know, you do not have to explain to New Yorkers why people shouldn't fly planes into towers. You do not have to explain to Londoners why people shouldn't blow up the tubes and buses. They really don't like it already. That one's easy. But the far more difficult case is to say that when somebody does do that, and they are here, and they are making a constant, intransigent case, do not think you can move even an inch nearer them and still be yourself. But that's what's happened. It's such a tendency in our societies. In Britain, they always say the truth lies in the middle. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The truth between Sharia and our law is not in the middle. It's not in a bit of Sharia. If one person comes toward you saying in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, an archangel landed and said all this stuff that was uncannily similar to the Old and New Testament, and this was the word of God, if that's their claim, which if they want to believe that's fine by me, but if they start to try to make me believe that, or to try to make my society, instead of saying, well, if that's your belief, very well, but that's not our belief, we don't reckon it happened like that, and we reckon Muhammad made the whole thing up, and so on, then there is no middle ground between those two positions. We can't, as it were, compromise that some of it was dictated by an archangel. Every other Tuesday. You can't pretend that, as it were, I mean, the terrible, really pissy thing that politicians do is that one where they quote bits of the Quran where it's clear that they haven't read it, or clear that they just don't want to. And then they say things like, but the Quran says, I mean, there is no compulsion in religion. And you go, so what if it does? I mean, it could say all sorts of things, but are you going to concede that it's true because of that? They have got a version of Islam which they wish to be true, and they have fatally mistaken what has been hitherto quite a good thing that we've had in Europe, which is a difference between things you wish to be true and the things that are in front of you. And therein lies our problem.
Thank you. One final question.
Thank you very much for your excellent sense of humor.
Thank you.
I was in a debate recently, and I defended the British Defence League. And I did that on the basis of a program on Danish television where the leader or whatever, he talked about the organization, and I got a pretty good impression of him. But now I realize on the basis of what you just said that I shouldn't support the British Defence League. Is that correct?
This is a very important question. I have had quite a tortured track record on this one for the following reason, which is that I've said for a long time that one of my great fears in Europe generally, but in my country in particular, would be that in the end, decent ordinary people, if the mainstream politicians didn't finally address these questions, decent ordinary people would find themselves stuck between Islamic fascists and other fascists, fighting it out between themselves. Now, I say that as a general point. However, on the question of the English Defence League, this is a very, very complex one. I'm not making a definitive point on this, although every time I say that about the English Defence League, some far leftist or Islamist organisation says that I'm saying something supportive of them. So, when they first started, I was doing an interview in East London, and they found out I was there, and they came and tried to speak to me. And I said at that time they were all sort of what I would describe as skin-headed types of a kind that the British National Party, that is a racist, fascist party. The British National Party, they looked of that type, and we didn't really know anything about the English Defence League at the time. But I said to them, I don't want to see you, go away. And I said it, I have to admit, in slightly stronger language. And they said, we're not the British National Party. And I said, well, look, I spend a lot of my life criticising politicians who say, but, Mr. Karadawi came in, he seemed nice and so on, and he promised he wasn't an Islamic fundamentalist, and I say, I could spend a lot of my time criticizing politicians for being naive on that one, so I'm afraid if you just say to me, you're not, I just don't know. I don't know who you are, what you are. But as I wrote it somewhere at the time, one of them said to me, we understand, we'll leave you alone, we just want to say we're just British working class guys who hate the fact that we're losing our country. And if you're a member of, I don't like thinking of it, but myself, I'm pretty, I'm privileged in the position I'm in. I'm not a working class unemployed guy. I have a job, I have a voice in the media and so on. When somebody says that to you, I can tell you it's a pretty wrenching thing. And it is a question that a lot of us have asked. What do we expect people to do? Those of us who have a voice in the media and who make arguments, and politicians and so on, what do we expect people to do on the ground? Now, when they had their first demonstrations, they said things like, they had posters saying things like, Sharia persecutes women, and Sharia is against homosexuals and so on. I said, if those are the things you're going on, then that's great with me. That would be, if you were ever to have a grassroots movement opposed to these things, that would be the sort of thing you would hope they would do it on. But it's an extremely complex phenomenon, because there have been investigations which have shown that they have extremists and BNP types in their ranks, but they have also shown they have tried to get such people out, and you have to give them the benefit of the doubt on some of that. They have tried, and it isn't easy, and it's a nascent grassroots starting off young movement, and they're learning some of the mistakes as they go along. And then on the other hand, there are also many people, there's a study that's coming out on Monday from the think tank Demos, showing that actually a majority of their supporters online and so on certainly aren't of a sort of nativist, type. They just hate what's happening. So I come back to this point really with them, that this is what happens when the mainstream loses. When the mainstream abandons its job. This is what happens. I mean, I hate to quote it in almost, it's a cliche, but this, as Yeats said, is what happens when the centre does not hold. The best lack all conviction, and the rest are filled with passionate intensity. That's the problem, and I think it should be, to me, treated with nuance, treated with care, and I hate the people in the media who simply see a group of working class white guys and think, excellent, we can call them Nazis, when they would never go into a mosque and see a group of Muslims and say, you're all Islamists. I hate that. But it requires enormous care, and it's going to require enormous care in the years ahead. And as I say, if they don't get in charge, if they don't get on top of the extreme Islamists, if they don't get on top of that, the EDL, and far worse, will be the sort of thing we will see far more of in Europe. And it will be a Europe that I think very few of us would want to be in.
If I may make just one small observation before we go on to the very last, ultimate question. You would say, and led into the accusation amongst the Free Press Society, that as their chairman they had a convicted criminal, namely me, which goes to show that this is an extremist organization of a racist view. As a matter of fact, I gave a speech a couple of months ago for the Radical Youth Group, that is the Social Liberal Party's youth organization in Denmark. And somebody said, wouldn't it be better if you chose it as a chairman, one who's not tainted by racist? And so I said, well, you have a point. Why don't you join the organization and come and you can vote for some other people on the board? You see what I mean? I mean, if you start out condemning people for being extremists and then you use that against them.
Yeah.
Well, you have to have some pretty good grounds on which to do that.
The facts will continue to matter. And your guy was wrong on his facts. That's why he's wrong.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thanks a lot for doing such a beautiful job on counter-depression stuff today for us. It's wonderful. Once we had a boss from our Royal Theatre in our panel, and someone asked him, would you consider putting up Biedermann and the Arsonists at your theatre? And he said no, because he found it was a little outdated, it was not in sync with the presence, and no. And
and just a couple of months later, he put up My Fair Lady. So, apart from you, Mr. Bean, what is the situation among the artists and the actors and people like that in Great Britain today?
I would just sum it up very briefly by saying that it is what it is everywhere, which is that everyone is scared and they don't want to admit they're scared because they all want to pat themselves on the back as being radical people who challenge society with difficult issues. So, for instance, Sir David Hare, just received the first Harold Pinter Award for theatre, saying he spent his career rowing against the tide, challenging all the mainstream ideas. Bullshit. David Hare has spent his life writing mainstream left-wing agitprop theatre. His last play was about the way in which the bankers seem to have misled everyone on the economy. The one before that was about how Tony Blair seems to have misled the people over the Iraq War. You see, again and again and again. And the point is, we have an elite of anti-elitists. We have an elite who pat themselves on the back for their grand countercultural abilities. They don't realize they are the culture. They are the culture. And they just love it. They love it. They award each other awards, and they all sit on the same panels for different awards that they give to that guy who was on the panel that gave them that award for their bravery in attacking George Bush. Or for standing up against Dick Cheney. And it must be awful for these people. You've got, in one way, you've got to feel sympathy for them. It must be awful for them. They have been told their whole lives that they're brave and they're cowards, the worst of the lot. And now the thing is, they must sense it. They must know it. And I wish them more and more torment